Okay, we'll kick off with some introduction. Ian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Ian Hollowbread, and I lead digital innovation for Group COO at ING.
Hi, everyone. I'm just known as Mirz. I work with many customers across the globe in terms of their compliance and regulations, and just happy to be here with you today.
Hi, I'm Adam Turnbull. I run regulatory engineering at Goldman Sachs, so I'm responsible for all non-financial regulatory reporting. In a prior life, I worked with equity traders on a bunch of front office applications.
Hi, folks. My name's Randeep Buttar. I'm the lead for Surety, which is a HCL partner. We're basically a RegTech platform that helps companies meet their regulatory obligations. I'll just start by saying it's a real pleasure to be here today amongst this panel and this moderator, and of course, recognize that there's a wealth of experience in the crowd as well, so very keen to see this evolve into an interactive discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, I was here last year, and I think we have double the size that we had last year, so it's going to be hopefully a very interactive session. Just a reminder, the Brella app, you can use that to actually ask some questions, and what we'll do towards the end, we'll keep about 15 minutes to use that time to address a lot of your questions. So kicking off, our very first question is around what regulatory challenges are top of the mind for financial services firm in 2023, and what operational changes are needed to overcome these challenges? I know from my perspective, there are so many challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis. It would be good to hear your thoughts, starting with Adam.
Yeah, I mean, really, where to start? There's so many different things. So, I mean, in my role, as I said, I run non-financial reg reporting, and I think the key thing that's the challenge is keeping up with the pace of change. I mean, I thought when I worked in the front office, you thought, oh, this is all kind of quite fast-paced, and, was reg kind of somehow sort of slower and less going on? I couldn't have been more wrong, really. When I came in, what I realized, first of all, is we don't set the dates that we have to do things. Other people do that. They're non-negotiable. And it's really just this constant wave of updating. We've seen, the requirements for transparency evolve across many more different asset classes. So there are new asset classes, securities financing, trade reporting went live, a couple of years ago as an example, that are now being covered. Regulators are also starting to rewrite a lot of the regulations, the swap dealer reporting regulations that, first came out of the G20 kind of 10 or so years ago. A lot of those are updating. And look, that's entirely understandable. The world we live in is moving on. The data that people need is different. And given the very long lead times to get data, it's not surprising that regulators would want to change that. So I think that's kind of challenge number one. And one little plea, as I was thinking about it, is actually, why do regulations always go live on the 1st of January? Could we maybe choose a different date so I don't have to lose my Christmas and New Year on repeated? I think we had a year off last year, which was good. So I think, that's kind of challenge number one. I think clearly data, and we'll talk a lot about that, we'll come back to that topic. The data has to be of good quality. We have to continually test and validate that our data is right. And the other thing I think is about keeping our systems up to date. So as an engineer, that matters to me a lot. And the analogy I always think of is I remember when my office near Blackfriars, they rebuilt the entire train station at Blackfriars and somehow kept the trains running all the way through, and I feel it's a little bit like that for us, really. We're trying to keep the systems up and running. We've got to deliver every day, but at the same time, it evolves, and the businesses are evolving. Volumes are constantly going up, and that's a good thing, and that's what we need to be able to recognise and adapt to. So I think that kind of, in terms of challenges, in terms of organisational changes, I'll just call out two things. Really, one, just reinforcing the point about it being all about data. And making sure that we have a really good understanding of where we get data from in the rest of the bank, and driving that not just in the reg layer, but all the way up the stack. So, which helps with, one, getting accountability, but also so that people understand how data they produce is used. And again, we'll come back to that point, I think, later on in the panel. And then the second point I'd think about is where can you mutualize effort? And obviously seeing a lot of vendors and other industry partners here, I think in the past we've tended, along with a lot of other FIs, to do a lot of things in-house. What are the things actually that we need to do in-house, but where can we, for instance, get buy-in technology, work in street-wide consortia to get rule sets and the like. So I think that's that's the key point. I mean, look, that's not a free lunch. It's hard sometimes for us to integrate our world with the rest of the world. And again, I think that's some challenges we may want to come back to.
Thanks. You touched on a number of items there. So I think data is definitely one that we'll touch on. But the integration point is really key because, again, even internally, there are lots of legacy systems and new applications that you have to integrate into. And it would be good to maybe add from your perspective as well, given your role as innovation lead.
Yeah, so obviously some of the challenges obviously is data, but and regulatory reporting and the influx of change. But if we don't talk about KYC, I think I shouldn't be here because that remains a kind of number one challenge across the industry. I still think all of us are struggling with the KYC challenges across the value chain, from client due diligence to transaction monitoring to screening. And I think that's a big challenge that the industry needs to address. When we talk about systems and integrations at ING, like one of our primary focus areas is scalable tech and ops, and how can we bring technology or emerging technology into scale. And I think it's really important with our traditional and legacy systems. So we've been looking at a lot around interoperability, ensuring for a seamless digital experience for users and for our customers. So I think that is key to success. I also think data from a privacy perspective is a big challenge for us all. And we need to ensure that we're protecting customer data and internal data across the platform. So alongside some of Adam's comments, I think that those are other big industry challenges and how we need to think about them.
So from a global perspective, I know this is an addition to the same question. For those of us that work in a global institution, what key challenges are you seeing? Because regulators do not always have the same agenda or priorities. So in addition to some of the data integration challenges that you've mentioned, is there anything else from a global perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we operate in over 40 different countries, and I'm sure Goldman's is similar. And keeping up the pace and change of regulation in 40 different countries with different regulators and different regulatory regimes is a huge problem for us all. So how do we ensure that we're delivering on compliance, we have the right controls in place, we have the right mechanisms to manage all of that change? And that can't just be done by humans. We need technology, and technology enables to do things better, faster and cheaper.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else?
Yeah, maybe I'd just add to that, that clearly in my role, we take data that may look quite similar, and then we need to report it in multiple different jurisdictions. And, in some cases there will be common elements to that, and we see some movement towards that actually in the swap reporting space, where regulators are converging around a set of common data elements. But in other cases it'll be different, and I think we've got to accept that striving for a world where every regulator asks for the same data everywhere is not realistic. Different regulators have different situations. It seems reasonable that things may diverge. So I think it's about planning for that up front. But it is a challenge because we may have moving parts on related bits of what we do that are changing at the same time. But that said, look, it's a great opportunity. We've set up a global team. It actually means we can run relatively much, follow the sun in a number of different areas, which actually means, we fundamentally can get more done. So, there's advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll move on to the digital side. Mirz and Randy, in terms of key priorities, from your perspective, what are the key priorities in terms of digital transformation that compliance leaders should be thinking about? Mirz?
Okay, so, well, first of all, we all recognise that compliance is about protecting our customers, the business and the shareholders. But when it comes to the digital transformation, what we're finding is that potentially increases the risk and potentially increases the problems. So it's kind of important to put compliance at the heart of digital transformation. And in terms of the priorities that we've seen, the first one is to do with data security and cyber security. The second one is to do with data security controls that we've seen as a priority. And the third one is automation. And the automation one is quite interesting because we're seeing that also lead to things like continuous monitoring and auditing. Yeah. I can kind of really talk about this from what we talk in terms of our customer advisory council that we run. And our customer advisory council is attended by some of the biggest banks, insurance companies and trading houses. And when they're around a room talking, one of the things that I've noticed recently is that they're all getting on board with doing continuous monitoring, auditing, and visibility of that. And we've started terming that observability. And what's interesting about that is they want to do this, but they want to do it in real time. They want to be able to do this in real time and show it to everyone. And the reason they want to do it in real time is because it gives them the ability to be proactive. They can notice and spot breaches straight away. The second is to do with the fact that they want to be able to communicate to the stakeholders when there is a breach. And the third is evidence and the evidence of the audit and the history, and to recognize patterns as well, so they can then fix things. The last thing is that they're also looking to do it in real time because they want to map out a business process so that when something goes wrong, they want to be able to drill down to the nth degree to see what's caused the problem, whether it's a hardware, software, process, people, whatever it is. They want to be able to drill down to that. I can also give you one perspective here. I was out in the Middle East recently, and I met with one of the biggest banks out there, and they've built this huge 20-meter wide display, which is like their control command center. And it looks really good. They got dashboards for everything. They're monitoring everything. You know, it's like, oh wow, pretty impressive. And it's 20 meters long. And then I asked them, well, where are you monitoring the compliance and where are you monitoring risk? And they kind of gave me a blank face because I hadn't even thought about it. And we started talking about it and about continuous monitoring and how that should be something that should be highlighted there as well. And how putting that in place, you know, becomes like your foundation. It becomes a foundation for an AI-led predictive compliance management. So that's kind of the sort of thing we've been talking to them about. And in fact, I think actually the next presentation, Gareth Dories, who's actually implemented this type of approach, will be talking about this as well. So, you know, the next presentation will be quite important. And I think, Randeep, you and I spoke about this before, about how observability in the context of regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that segue, Mirz. So I mean, look, so business process monitoring and observability and the automation of that has been happening for quite some time. But I think where we're starting to see the trends evolving is more and more people want to see this in the context of compliance and regulation. So actually being able to trace what you're monitoring all the way back to your regulatory obligations within the regulatory text itself. See that journey go from the text to your internal controls, your operating model, and ultimately into something that can be monitored, ideally in real time or near real time if it's not a manual requirement. If it can be automated, then wrapping that up into something that can then generate some kind of a compliance score, which actually will serve to make the conversation with the supervisor a lot more pointed, a lot more evidence-based. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we're definitely seeing more scrutiny being applied by supervisors in this regard, and they're wanting to see like that more clear view of how you're evidencing your compliance state.
Totally agree. I think one of the things, though, is given the volume of regulations, so again, taking that global lens, you could have thousands, if not millions in some cases, of specific obligations. And then targeting that and taking that into the compliance space where you have your risk and controls, how do you actually rationalize these volume of regulations to specific risk and controls to make it more meaningful to the business as well as the compliance officers?
You use RegTech. Actually, it's really interesting because we done a similar exercise last year where we took a regulatory technology tool which standardized these risks and controls across the industry. And effectively what we learned from the experimentation is we took 3 countries in our retail business. We had 2,000 controls and using application from the industry to industry standardize those controls, we was able to compress those controls to 1,000. So that's half the controls within that. But it's connecting it all together. So the underlying obligations or the regulatory change to the risks and controls, and further what products and services and extensions around that, and how do we feed that in and out of our core GRC platforms as well to ensure it works seamlessly all together. So I think it's a big challenge. And we talk about like artificial intelligence as well, being able, natural language processing, and we've been using technologies like that for the last 5 years. And obviously ChatGPT is forefront of everyone's mind at the moment, and it really does add value, but it's also that human element that we need to apply on top of that.
Sure. Yeah. Anything else to add?
Can I just add, I mean, I think it's also, go back to the point about monitoring and creating the feedback loop. I mean, again, when I moved from equities, the feedback loop was very immediate. You know, if I was responsible for a platform that sent trades downstream, the trades didn't go downstream, the client didn't get settlement, you know, and you knew very quickly. I think in some of what we do here, the feedback loop is not as quick. Yes, sure, we may know, did we get a message acknowledged by the trade repository? But you know, that's not enough. You need to know, was it acknowledged, and was the data all correct? And so again, I think that's where we have to work to create those feedback loops, so that in near real time, you know, we can see, is our data good, and if there is an issue with it, we can take action and we can correct.
So can I just add to that?
Yeah,
So
sure.
we talked a little bit earlier about regulatory divergence, and the fact is that in different jurisdictions, you have a different bar sometimes, and certainly if you look at mainland Europe and what's happening in the UK, you're seeing that divergence play out right now with the Edinburgh reforms as an example. So I've seen this challenge both as a practitioner, because prior to working on Surety, I was head of data transformation and regulation over at HSBC. I managed a number of regulatory initiatives. And what we found was that it would be very useful to harmonize your controls in a way that allows you to actually map them through to multiple obligations from multiple jurisdictions. So almost like the one-to-many relationship,
Yeah.
which says, I've got a control, but actually if I can evidence and score this control once, it satisfies multiple regulations in multiple jurisdictions. So you can take, for example, BCBS 239, which is to do with risk data aggregation, risk reporting. If you're compliant against that here, chances are you're probably about 60% compliant against CCAR over in the States.
Yeah.
So being able to establish those relationships and those overlaps is a very good way of getting a more efficient compliant operation in play.
Totally agree, and I think there's a lot of data scrubbing that needs to be done to achieve those aims. Just moving on to the next question, which fits quite nicely from what we were discussing earlier on, is technology ecosystems. So what kind of technology ecosystems should FIS leverage to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of their compliance activities? Ian?
Yep.
Yeah.
So like ecosystems in the regulatory space are very important. And I think obviously there's probably over 1,500 RegTechs, although RegTech Global will probably have a better view on that across the market. So how do you know who to work with, what the right companies are, how will it add value to you? It's using the ecosystem, and it's working closely with the regulators, the advisory firms, the VCs to really enable the change to happen. If we don't work together as an ecosystem, we really struggle to get the right solutions, to scale the solutions across the industry. So obviously the ecosystem plays an important role in various like utilities as well that have been set up to help the developments of certain activities such as KYC. So there is a really important place for them, and we should be utilising them much more than probably we do today to make the change that's needed across the industry.
Sure, thank you. And Randy, in terms of getting ready for an initial engagement, because I think one of the key things is, I know there's been evolution of the fintech companies, but certainly some of them are quite new to the financial services sector in the first instance. So getting them ready to engage with bigger firms, how would you go about?
Yeah, I think so. I can probably speak about this from a number of different angles. So I think just in general, if you're a RegTech or a fintech that's coming up, getting away from the academic use case, getting into something more practical, actually looking for the market fit, going out, speaking to the industry, speaking to your target, and just validating your assumptions. I mean, that's just obvious. But what we're trying to focus on are things like partnerships, right? So curating content or data partnerships is one example. So for example, we just recently signed an MOU with the GRI. GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative. It's one of the preeminent sustainability disclosure frameworks used around the world, not just in financial services, but in multiple sectors. And so, we're licensed, we're authorized to use their content in our platform, which actually means that if there are clients out there who align themselves to those standards, we can immediately give them a solution that they understand, they recognize, and we're speaking the same language. So that's one, I would say, content and data. The other thing is really around procurement networks and distribution channels. So we're starting to see a lot of companies emerge who actually get you ready for those initial conversations with the financial institutions, because what they're doing is they're preparing you for the vendor risk management conversation. So, you know, they're asking you those questions that you know, hopefully you won't get caught on the back foot. You're well prepared. You know, you understand that you're going to be asked about your resilience. You're going to be asked about your security controls and your operational risk management controls and so on. So I think that would be my advice to any RegTech coming up, is focus on having content and data that's relevant to your target market, but also being prepared for those initial vendor risk conversations as well.
And it takes a long time to get through those.
There's that too.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that insight. So the next question is around how are FIS tackling the current data storage and data quality of data. I know we touched on data earlier on, so it'd be good to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll split this into three elements, really. I think the first one is looking at how do we model and exchange data within our firms. I mean, we create an enormous amount of data. So we've certainly been working with, we have an internal modeling language called Alloy, which we've been working to get in place really good data contracts between ourselves and the other parts of the firm. And I think if I go back, kind of the old way of doing this was, you know, I had a particular obligation that we needed to satisfy. You know, we would create some kind of bilateral contract with, you know, whoever it was that was producing the data. Great, off we went. But the thing with that is you lead to the point where you end up with multiple of these things, and it becomes very hard to manage. So we're trying to get to the place much more where we think more carefully around what is an authoritative data source, where do I go, how do I have a logical map. And it's very hard as engineers. We like to talk a lot about, you know, the physical database it's in that database or this database, and actually trying to move people away from that a little bit and talk more about logical models, and then how we can reuse those logical models. So I guess that's kind of the first element. And I think the second element is a lot of the logic for this in the past has been inside code. So when we say, where does that data come from, you know, quite often we need a developer, maybe on my team, maybe somewhere else, who needs to go in, open up the code, and we look at the store procedure, we look at some other bit of code, and we say, that's where we get it from. So how do we bring that out of code in a way that non-coders can track? And that's, again, where data modeling languages come in. So that's a piece of work I think we feel very passionately about. You know, we've open sourced Legend, which is kind of the open source version of our internal language, you know, and there are a number of other open source type languages doing a similar thing. So I think that's going to be very, very powerful to kind of democratize, if you like, kind of who can see those data lineages. And I think the third piece is looking at, you know, how do we then link the reporting the reporting instructions with the data that we've just created. And, you know, we talk about modernizing reporting instructions. So we're working along with a number of other people on the street with ISDA on a project to digitize reporting instructions. And one of the key foundations there is having a common external model that you can map your data to, and then you can express your reporting instructions with respect to that external common domain model. And that has a number of other benefits. You know, actually, Randeep talked about preparing, you know, for vendors preparing for conversations with FIs. And one of the challenges we have a lot is the product is great, but the integration is going to be really hard. I've got to go from my internal model, and actually 90% of the work is getting some, you know, complex internal model to map to the external product. And if I get that wrong, it kind of invalidates the use of that product. Now, if we can begin to move towards more standard models, so for instance, I already talked some external model, your system talks some external model, hopefully the same model, then that integration problem becomes much less hard to climb. So I think that's, you know, moving towards that process of being able to talk a common language is important. It's hard though. You know, I mean, how do we, you know, what I call an allocation or somebody else calls an execution, they may be different. We all have different workflows and processes. So look, I think that's for me, those three things would be the most important.
Maybe just expanding on that a little. When we talk about the standardization of data, even within a firm, sub-business lines, you have different terminologies being used. So what actions have you taken to try and standardize the language internally first before we start integrating externally?
Right, and that's where I think we have to fight against the need, particularly if you're under time pressure, to kind of, as I call it, go bilateral, where I sort of, I might have a feed from from one desk, where they describe products with a particular taxonomy, and a different desk is using a totally different taxonomy, and that's really, again, coming back to the logical model concept of like, well, hang on a sec, we think we've modeled that concept over here. Yeah. You guys need to conform, and look, and that's not always easy, right? Because people, particularly as you push that up the stack, that means everybody has to kind of play by the same rules. Yeah. So but yeah, I think really that focus on data modeling is the way you have to do it.
And Mirz, from your side, in terms of the data storage piece, and maybe touch on open source as well, because that's quite interesting to hear. To be good to hear. So maybe Mirz, do you want to add to that?
Well, just in terms of your general question was. There's one interesting thing is that, I worked in the data quality industry before doing the role I'm doing now, and I did it for many years, and we put data quality solutions together for Lloyd's and HSBC and so on. And the first thing is that it's a never-ending, continuous exercise to make sure your data's right. And it's like on a treadmill, and you can never stop. It's like that. And putting the right data governance in place is really key. And we used to put master data management solutions in place to bring in all that data, to link it all together, to enrich that data. But the amount of data that's available now has increased as well. We've got logs and data for everything. So the hard bit is actually how do you link that data, and where's the value from that data to the controls? Yeah. And that's the bit where it gets interesting, because the data's there for you to do everything, but it's actually getting to the right data. And that's, I think, the issue. And then even when you've got that data, it's like, where do you have people have a lack of trust of the data because of confidence levels in it. Where's the data come from? How accurate is it? So the main thing I'd say is that, that investment you're doing in data quality has to be continuous. You have to put the right data governance in place. And, this is never going to stop.
Yeah, definitely. Did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, no, I think like the open source work that obviously Goldman's, Morgan Stanley have been doing is really interesting on data and data languages. So, and CDM is a great project. So we've been supporting the Linux Foundation and Finos to try and drive that standardization. Look, it's some way off, I think, for industry in its entirety, but it's absolutely the right direction that industry needs to go in. And to your point, Mirz, it's all as well. We've been looking at how we utilise different tools within the bank, so like market division tools, which allow us to surface and connect data much more easily. So we've been working with a company invested in a company called OpenFin, which is probably used by a number of other banks, which has been in front office, has been how you use data much better, like your iOS operating system, bringing that into the regulatory space to say, actually, we've got 15, 20 different applications here. Can we connect the common data points, whether it's an LEI code, across those applications seamlessly at any one point in time? So it helps our users really identify and understand and drill into the data components much, much better.
Sure. Just a reminder, I haven't seen any questions come through, so please think of your questions. We have about 5 more minutes before we open the floor up. Just maybe touching back on that data element, given that we're talking about RegTech in particular, we touched on at the very beginning how the speed of change, so there's lots of new regulations every day, really. You have different regulators publishing new regulations. Coupled with that, in terms of the data, the legacy data, or existing data that we have, the need to scrub and standardize, how do you then manage that whole new regulations coming in and your data that you're trying to scrub at the same time to move forward to the next stage? I know this is not a question here.
Can I touch on this?
Sure.
So I don't envy the compliance managers or the data managers, right? Because they're building the plane, they're flying the plane, they're measuring the rivets on the plane all in parallel. I think there are a few sides to this. So there's regulation that's right in front of you that you need to address. There's the changing regulations, and the stat that I've read is 50,000 sort of changes to regulation globally per annum. And then, of course, there's the stuff that's coming on the horizon, so how do you prepare for that? So if you think a bit, you mentioned earlier there was a question around digital transformation. So if you look at it from the perspective of transformation, change, whether it's technological change, operating model change, or you're changing a product, it's really important to have hooks into those processes, toll gates almost, and this is just practical advice around making sure that when you design something, you're designing compliance in or you're designing data controls in by default. You don't get to go live until those things have actually happened. So that can include things like making sure that you've defined your canonical logical data model, you've defined your data elements, there's a standard definition for them, making sure that they're going to be sourced from a common place, a golden source or a golden distributor, because some places use hubs. And in addition to that, mapping out the data lineage and factoring that all into your BAU processes. So making sure that these things are actually built into the design of your transformation before you actually go into BAU. And then once you're in BAU, you're constantly monitoring and seeing how that evolves.
Thanks. Any other additions?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think the constant monitoring is important because, you know, much as we may build an architecture for collection and distribution of that data, you know, there are lots of clever people who will be constantly evolving our business models and moving into new products, new services. And so, you know, being able to have the ability to respond to and continually test your data against that is super important because, you know, there is a natural, you know, I think we all will have seen it, that you effectively otherwise have a natural decay of, you know, over time, you know, something that was right 5 years ago, well, the business has moved on, you've got to be able to keep up with, that and make sure you're now sourcing from, you know, whatever the new place is. So I think that, and again, it goes back really to what I said earlier about creating the feedback loop for yourself, that you get notifications, you get warnings when something has changed or something needs looking at.
Thanks. So going on to the final questions, our regulators are also faced with the speed of change because they have to monitor and regulate the financial services institution. And the FCA recently has talked about being a data-driven regulator. So again, this speaks to their agenda around regulations and data. So with regards to this is questions for everyone on the panel, is how can regulators support the advancement of regulatory innovation?
I think the regulators need to be closer to the problem, actually, and be closer to working with the RegTechs and the financial institutions. I think it's too distant at the moment. I don't think they're close enough to the underlying problems that the institutions and actually probably the regulators face on how technology can apply. So I actually think they need to be much more closer to the problem.
Thanks. Mirz?
It's quite an interesting one because the regulators bring out the regulation and everyone just rushes around trying to see if they can comply with it and how they're going to put it into place. But quite often, the people that get recognised are the big four, you know, the big four consultants. And they you know, the ones that get the most and visibility of it all. I think what the regulators should maybe do is have almost like an innovation centre where they go, you know, we've come up with this regulation. This is something we've got to adhere to, and we're going to set something up where new vendors can come and showcase what they can do. So somebody can come along and see maybe multiple ways of approaching that problem, and then they can hopefully open up to smaller vendors as well. Why should it always be on some of the bigger ones as well? Because I've seen. I mean, I work for a really big company as well, but I've seen some small companies that are very innovative and creative, and it's hard for them to get their voice out.
Sure.
I think it's got to be one step further, like evidencing the value of those small vendors. The regulators got to work with them as well as us to evidence value, because it's all right showcasing, but if you don't see value, then it's difficult to move.
And it may be even setting up like a sandbox so people can test out to make sure their solutions are compliant with the regulation. It's something I think Bank of England actually did as a test, and it was quite effective.
Sure. No, thanks. Adam, any?
Yeah, I would probably go back to the point about, you know, helping us create a collaborative environment where we can get common data standards, because I think once we've got that, it unlocks a number of other problems. And I think, you know, we have to be realistic. Regulation, as I said earlier, won't be the same everywhere across the globe. So I think, you know, that's probably not a sensible ask from us as financial institutions, but helping create the conditions where the industry can collaborate. And look, that's not easy because, you know, to some extent, as financial institutions, we know our business models, you know, the best, and we will therefore in some ways be in a position to map those, you know, better than anyone else. But we need, and you know, it's very helpful to us to have an environment where that can work across industry and particularly across products. You know, and I think again in places where we have trade associations, you know, or other kind of you know, industry bodies, that can help and fill in those gaps. But there will still be pockets that will be left uncovered. And again, I think that's where regulators can help us get to that more complete coverage.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to build on that. So I think there's a specific use case here, which is, you can call it sub-tech, but ultimately what we've been advocating for with the supervisors is anonymizing, making interpretation from the system more transparent. So if you're overseeing a number of regulatory entities, you've issued an edict, a directive or legislation that they must all adhere to, wouldn't it be really useful for people to be able to see in an anonymized way how people are interpreting certain obligations, certain clauses? Mm-hmm. So then there's a number of benefits in that. It's beneficial to the people being regulated because they can see whether or not they're part of the common standard or they're actually sort of off on the right, doing something very different and unique. Maybe they need to change their approach, bring themselves in. But then for the supervisor, it's also very useful because for them, it can also influence the way in which they're determining policy and actually help them make decisions around the impact of regulation on the actual system itself.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. I can empathize because in terms of from a regulations perspective, the interpretation even internally can vary depending on what lens you're looking at it from.
Yeah, it's
right?
interesting because what you both just said. When I was involved when FATCA first came out, everybody rushed around trying to put FATCA in place, and I was dealing with a bank in the UK and a bank in Mexico, and they had completely different interpretations, and we had to go, well, okay, let's break down what this really means. And it took some time. And now they've both got the right thing in place, but initially they spent a lot of time, wasting the time trying to get to the right thing.
I guess this is where maybe the open source will probably help as well. So I think maybe investing and having more people join that open source might be a way to share anonymized data to some extent.
Yeah, and I think that's the interpretation point is very, very interesting because also running an engineering team, the last thing we want is we spend 80% of the time available to do regulation discussing what does this field mean or what does that field mean, and then 20% of the time where my developers actually get to actually write something. That's a paradigm that we don't like. So yeah, look, I think it is interesting as we talk with colleagues across the street. Sometimes we do get fields where we say, well, hang on, I've interpreted that in this way, someone else interpreted it in another way. Both are plausibly right, but they will be, if we go down that path, it will lead to inconsistency. So having, and again, I think that's where we see some of the digitization work we're doing is an opportunity or a forum whereby we can kind of front load those discussions.
Thanks. Any other thing to add as we open the floor to the audience? No? Okay. There's a question here around consumer duty. I'm sure everyone around the room has had some dealing with consumer duty, given the imminent implementation. So the question is, consumer duty is just around the corner. Do you think that most firms are prepared, and has the FCA been supportive enough? Does anyone want to take this?
So, probably not. Most firms are probably not prepared enough. We've been doing work with product governance and how we can digitalise affect things like consumer duty. From a UK perspective, wholesale, we're not that impacted from an ING perspective on consumer duty. But yeah, I don't believe, talking to the vendors that I'm working with, that firms and advisory firms are anywhere near enough, far enough down the track to be able to support this in its entirety.
Any other additions? No. Okay. Another question, I think we covered some of this. This is really around, I'm hoping we have regulators in the room, so hopefully they can help answer some of those questions as well. It's, again, going back to the points that we made in terms of what do we want to see more, also what role should regulators play with regard to RegTech? I think we've touched on this in our previous question. But in terms of encouraging adoption, I know we talked about maybe having a lab, an innovative lab, whereby fintechs can come and showcase their products. How do you think this, maybe if we expand a bit more on that, how do the regulators go about selecting which fintech participates in that? And
this has been something that very early on in my journey, I realized that actually was a bit of a dead end. So, you go out, the first people you want to speak to are the regulators. It's like, guys, what do you think about this tech we're building? And whilst they can give you sort of anecdotal guidance and, try and point you in the right direction, they will never sort of fully rubber stamp you. as a vendor. And in a way, I kind of understand that, because that could lead to a conflict of interest. Obviously, they are a regulator, so they have to maintain independence. But I feel as though like maybe that can be loosened a little bit if they take specific policies, specific regulations, and find actually there's a really good solution out there in the market that could be advocated, because it will just help them supervise these entities better. I think that would be very useful if they can almost have like, okay, well, here's the top 10 vendors that we've seen, which we think actually are offering suitable solutions for this particular use case.
I think they want to be seen to be independent. So
Yeah.
the only way around that is actually going, well, here's the regulation. Here, if you can prove you can adhere to that, we'll make you available as one of the approved people who we've already checked out. Maybe that's the way to do it.
The best piece of work I've done in my years in RegTech was with the FCA. It's where they shadowed us on a machine learning project on MiFID II. So we run MiFID II for a number of RTSs. We done it with another bank in Australia. We had an independent law firm review it, and the FCA observed. And the best thing is we all learn what the impact was of using that technology. And we could share that impact with the industry. That was the best piece of work, because we subsequently adopted that piece of technology, invested in that technology, and that technology is scaled to other financial institutions. That learning could then be taken back in the regulators, and it was impact available today. And I think that was really valuable, not only for the RegTech, but also the financial institutions and the regulators. We've not done that since. There's not been other regulators that come to me to ask to do that. But I think it's a really important piece of learning. I think it was most valuable.
Adam, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think the other thing is we'll all naturally be quite risk averse. You have a fixed deadline to comply with something, and you're looking at, can I do this in a new and innovative way, or do I do it the way that we've always done it, because that has kind of worked, albeit with some undesirable features maybe. So I think, and building on what Ian said, helping create the environment where we can start to take a little bit more implementation risk in terms of moving to some new ways of doing things, and working with the industry and with us, such that we can make that leap, because I think it is a big it's a big issue, and you touched on a little bit when you talked about vendors coming into financial institutions. I've got a fixed deadline. I've got to comply with this thing. Do I go and do something that's new and untested, but potentially much better, or do I stick with the way of doing it that we've always done it, that is known? That's a big call to make, and we have very little margin of error. So again, helping create an environment where we can make more of those calls and try and evolve the way we do things, I think would be really helpful.
Thanks.
As a vendor, I must say it's actually quite hard to get in front of the right people. So you might have the perfect solution, but if no one's willing to talk to you, it's hard for them to see it and see what it's about, and for you to explain it to them. So for all those people over here who are attending this, who I'd just say give the vendors a chance, come out and talk to them and see what they've got, and see if it'll help you.
Thanks. I think we talked a lot about what the regulators can do, what we as a firm, the challenges we're facing, etc. And you touched on that a bit, Mirz, in terms of vendors. So from the RegTech industry, what do we want to see more of? I know sometimes it feels like somebody's producing a product, and they haven't fully tested it, and they want to try and push it and sell. So it's a waste of time for the financial services, because we're all busy, there's so many things going on. And for the vendor as well, because from a credibility perspective, pushing a product that you've probably not fully tested may not sit well for future engagement. So what would we like to see? And I'll just go around the room from the RegTech industry.
So I think there's two things here. So one is, obviously, it would be really helpful to see use cases, like specific, tangible, real-world use cases from the FIs. But then I guess the vendors also, I think there's a lesson here for us, which is around collaboration. So it's a massive ecosystem. RegTech is phenomenally huge. Again, there was a stat that I read. I think the software industry for reg reporting is valued at 2.6 billion per annum, and actually has a CAGR growth rate of around 18%. So it tells you that actually this thing is massive. And what we should be doing is more collaboration and packaging up of our solutions, so that we can provide FIs with an end-to-end offering. So what I mean by that is, let's take a horizon scanning platform. Let's link that into a workflow tool, which links into a controls repository, which can ultimately generate visuals that you can, see dashboards to understand your compliance state, and then land with a reporting engine that allows you to make your disclosures internally and externally to the vendor, to the supervisor. So I think there's certainly the need for more collaboration, not just with the FIs to understand their use cases, but amongst ourselves as well.
Thanks. Adam?
Yeah, I'd echo that, I think, because otherwise the burden falls on the financial institution to try and work out how do you string together what may be multiple different vendor solutions. I mean, we were talking to a vendor, recently, about a product they have, and the product looks great, but it was quite hard for us to envisage the exact use case and the gap that it was filling. And I think we sort of, we get there in the end, but so being clearer about, what is the problem it's solving. And I think the other thing, and Randeep and I talked about this a little bit before the panel, is just thinking about a pathway to integration. Again, a lot of the time we'll see very good products, but the barrier of just how on earth do I plug in all the things that my institution does into that product becomes sometimes too high. So whatever can be done to lower that barrier, it will make it easier for us and make us more confident, frankly.
Can I just add, sorry to interject, but we did talk about this, right? And don't create a mapping challenge. So if you're a vendor and if you're offering a solution, the last thing an FI wants to hear is that, okay, great solution, but now I've got to map my entire organization to your data model and your way of seeing the world. It's got to be open, it's got to be agile, extensible data model, that sort of thing.
Thanks. Mirz?
Two things on this. I remember when sanctions processing first came out, and I was working for an organization that had a innovative solution, but it wasn't fully out there because it was still new. And so the only way around that was to find an appropriate financial institution, and we worked in collaboration with them. We worked with them so that the solution they would understand would be able to take to the general market, but we'd work with them to get it up and running in their environment first. And even today now, with what we're doing today, and we have a much more robust solution, but financial institutions are risk adverse. And so what we now do is go, look, we want to show you how to do continuous monitoring in real time. We identify a suitable business process. We identify the data and the controls that are needed. And then we say to them, we'll actually build some of it for you to show it in your environment. The hard bit is still, so you have to get around the risk and compliance team who kind of don't want to, make anything available. They don't want to open anything up and so on. But we get around that sometimes, but it's hard work.
Sure. Ian?
I'd like to see a centre of excellence for regulation that allows the right pathways for early stage, late stage companies to work together with regulators, financial institutions, advisory and big tech, and because it's a challenge for us all. So, and I think obviously if there was a centre that enabled that to flow in a particular way, then it could benefit us all greatly.
Thank you. I think you've covered it really well. There's so much that we can all learn, vice versa, just from experience as well. One of the things is really around transparency in terms of when you're building a product and you still have more to build, just be transparent with the financial services sector as well, because otherwise a hope is pinned on something that might be half-baked and it's not quite there yet. So it's really that transparency that's quite important. I'm conscious that we're almost running out of time. Are there any questions from the audience? Any open questions? Okay, somebody passing on the mic, please. Thanks.
Hi, Miles Barker from Credit Suisse. I guess this is more of a counterpoint than a question. So, full disclosure, amongst other things, I'm one of the industry advisors to the Bank of England Transforming Data Collection thing. And as part of that, I am one of the panel that actually reviews vendor submissions. I think the problem is that people are sometimes choosing to misunderstand the question. So the question that is being asked is how can your technology help the Bank of England internally to transform regulation and get towards digitised regulation? And the majority of the vendors unfortunately turn up thinking, how can I get the Bank of England to approve me to go out and force all of their regulated firms to use me? Which is not it's not the question, so there's a listening issue. Secondly, that they're coming with how can I use my technology to do the existing regulation, not how can I help to get towards the 2B regulation. And thirdly, that they're subject to competition law, so they just can't. It's an unrealistic expectation. So I think it's you have kind of touched on it, it's listening, but it's thinking about what is the problem. And what is the problem that's being asked for by a specific institution, in which in this case is not how can I do the same thing faster.
Sure.
Yeah.
Very
I wonder
point,
if we can expand the scope of Global RegTech Summit to include subtech as well. Right.
Yeah, I think we've run out of time. I know there was one more question, but are we okay to take that one question? Yep, thanks.
All right. So I wanted to ask you, we hear there's a lot of communication.
Maybe louder, yeah.
It should be on. We hear there's like a lot of communication breakdowns, misunderstanding of different regulation. Why isn't there, like, instead of a centre of excellence, like more like a centre of enablement from the regulatory sectors? Why don't we see centres where we all collaborate, where we've got a single source platform, for instance, for RegTechs to all to come in and enable each other to meet and understand these new regulations so we understand it fully? Why hasn't that not been created, do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think whether you call it a centre of excellence or a centre of enablement, the same is one and the same for me. There needs to be that centre that helps industry work together. It's too fragmented at the moment.
It's interesting because we've actually put a solution in place at one of the largest banks in Europe. They absolutely love it. They think it's brilliant, but they don't want to talk to anyone about it, and they won't even let us do a press release. They won't do any. So it's kind of like they see it as a competitive advantage. They don't want to share it. So it's sometimes the financial institutions themselves not sharing that as well.
So it does sort of touch back to the point made earlier around can we anonymize interpretation?
Yeah.
Can we create an ecosystem in which that information can be shared, beneficial to both the regulated as well as the regulator?
Yeah, and maybe just wrapping up on that, in terms of whatever we create, there's a cost element to that as well. Who's going to be running that centre of excellence or the enablement centres is really thinking about how do we make this happen in the ecosystem. But very interesting points. Really enjoyed chatting with you all, and thank you so much for a lovely audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you.